The ice did not warn him. It never does. It simply decides, and everything beneath must answer. The moment arrived without ceremony, a low groan in the blue ceiling of the ravine, a breath held by the land itself, then the fracture, white veins racing through ancient ice like memory breaking under pressure. He moved before thought, before fear could shape itself into language, stepping into the fall with his shoulders hunched and his spine braced, turning his back to the collapse so that it would strike him first. He did not know her name then, only the shape of her stillness, the way she stood listening with her whole body, how the cold had taught her to read danger the way others read clocks. When the ice came down, it struck him like a verdict, and he folded around her without asking if she wanted to be shielded because some choices are older than consent, older than words, older than the men who carry them. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. They lay there after, the ice scattered, the ravine quiet again, the world pretending it had done nothing unusual. His breath burned his chest, shallow and uneven, a sound too loud for a place that prized silence. She did not touch him at first. Inuit hunters are taught not to rush the injured, not to disturb the story the body is telling itself. She watched the way he held his ribs, the tremor in his hands, the way pain made him careful, almost reverent. Snow clung to her lashes. When she blinked, it fell like salt. The wind cut along the ravine wall and found the wet places on their faces. Somewhere above, the ice settled, satisfied for now. He had not planned to be here. He had planned very little since the loss that unmade him, the loss that left him walking with the posture of someone apologizing to the world. He had followed work north because work did not ask questions, because cold has a way of narrowing life to tasks and breath and survival, and he needed that narrowing the way a drowning man needs a hand. He was a forastero, a man who carried his mistakes like packed gear, useful, heavy, never unpacked. When he looked at her, he did so carefully, as if looking too directly might be another trespass. He had already crossed enough lines in his life to know when to move slowly. She rose first, not with haste, but with certainty, as if the ground itself recognized her weight and steadied. The Huntress, guardian, some would say, though she would never, moved with the economy of someone raised by winter. Her parka bore the quiet signs of repair, sinew and patience stitched where others would have replaced. She extended a hand, palm open, the gesture simple and unadorned. He took it, surprised by the warmth there, by the way her grip anchored him without insisting on anything else. When he stood, the pain sharpened, and he let it, accepting it as a cost already paid. They did not speak much as they walked. Speech wastes heat. She led him out of the ravine along a path the snow remembered even when men did not. The sky flattened into a hard, pale sheet. The sun hung low, a coin pressed against glass. He noticed details the way one does when fear loosens its grip, how her breath fogged and vanished, how the leather of her mitts creaked softly, how the ice underfoot sang a thin, warning note. She noticed him, too. He sensed it. The way his steps favored one side, the way he paused to swallow pain, the way he watched the land with eyes that had learned caution somewhere far from here. At the shelter, low, built to endure rather than impress, she motioned him inside. The wood stuttered and popped as the cold relinquished its hold. Smoke rose thin and honest. She set water to melt, the ritual precise, practiced. He sat where she indicated, the bench cold through his layers, and allowed himself to be still. Stillness, he had learned, was not the absence of movement, but the presence of listening. The shelter listened back, to the wind, to the ice shifting in its sleep, to the two bodies learning each other's weight in the same small space. She checked his ribs with a gentleness that surprised him, not because it was soft, but because it was exact. Pain flared. He inhaled and did not pull away. Respect travels both directions in places like this. She nodded once, an acknowledgement that was not reassurance, but truth. He would be sore. He would heal. The land had taken its due. When she finished, she sat across from him, close enough that he could feel the heat of her through the cold air, far enough that neither felt crowded. Her eyes held a depth he did not try to measure. Depths can be dangerous to men who have already drowned once. Outside, the ice settled again, the long sound of something ancient choosing patience over collapse. Inside, the shelter held. He watched her hands as she worked, hands that knew how to pull life from cold, how to read the thin language of winter. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him, a liability, a story, a man shaped by regret. He wondered, too, what it meant that when the ice fell, she had not moved away from him. Some questions, he suspected, would only answer themselves with time, and time here was measured in weather and trust. When she finally spoke, it was not a question. It was an observation, delivered as one offers a map to someone who has been lost longer than he admits. He felt something in his chest loosen, not the pain, but the knot beneath it, the one that had made him walk with his shoulders turned inward. The wind pressed against the shelter as if listening. The ice, for once, remained silent. The night did not arrive so much as it thickened, turning light into something granular and slow, each minute settling like frost on the edges of thought. Inside the shelter, the fire found a rhythm that matched breathing. Flare, settle, flare. While the wind learned the shape of the walls and tested them with patient insistence. He sat with his back straight despite the ache, because slouching felt like surrender, and he had surrendered enough in other places. She moved without hurry, her presence steady, as if the shelter had been built around her rather than the other way around. The cold teaches you what is essential. It peels life down to the bone and leaves only what can be carried without apology. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. She offered him tea made from what the land allowed, bitter, clean, a taste that lingered in the mouth like memory. He accepted it with both hands, the cup warming his fingers first, then his palms, then something deeper he hadn't named. Steam brushed his face and left a trace of moisture that the cold immediately claimed, turning it into a thin shell that cracked when he smiled without meaning to. He caught himself surprised by the reflex. Smiles had been rationed in his life lately, spent carefully, like fuel you might need later. Across from him, she watched not the smile, but the moment after, the way it faded and left honesty behind. She spoke of the ice as if it were a neighbor rather than a threat, describing how it shifts its weight with the seasons, how it remembers storms long after men have forgotten them. Her words carried no ornament, no mysticism for its own sake, only observation passed down because observation keeps you alive. He listened the way a man listens when he knows he has more to learn than to offer. In the pauses between her sentences, the shelter filled with sound, wood sighing, wind combing the snow outside, the faint ticking of ice cooling after movement. Each sound found its place and stayed there, content. He told her eventually why he had come so far north. Not the whole story. Stories like his have sharp edges, but enough that the shape of his absence could be understood. He spoke of work that required distance, of a life narrowed by loss until the horizon felt safer than rooms with mirrors. He did not name the person he had lost. Names give grief something to hook into, and he was not ready for that. She did not press him. Pressing breaks things that need time. Instead, she nodded once, the kind of nod that acknowledges weight without pretending to carry it for you. When she checked his ribs again, her hands were warmer now, or perhaps his body had remembered how to receive heat. Pain answered her touch honestly, but it was pain that belonged to healing rather than damage, a difference the body knows even when the mind doubts. She bound him with practiced care, the fabric snug without stealing breath. He noticed how close she was then, how the space between them had shrunk without ceremony. The cold outside pressed harder, as if jealous of the warmth it could not reach. Snow rattled against the shelter and fell away. They shared food in silence that did not feel empty. Silence, he was learning, can be a form of respect. He watched her eat, measured, unhurried, and felt the strange calm of someone who has stopped scanning for exits. He did not ask how long she had lived here. Such questions assume permanence where winter allows none. Instead, he asked about the trail she had chosen that morning, about the way the ravine had sounded before it broke. She answered with details rather than conclusions, teaching him how to listen for danger without fear. In her telling, the land was not an adversary, but a partner that demanded attention and returned survival in exchange. Later, when the fire burned low and the shelter held a deeper quiet, she stood and opened the door just enough to look out. Cold rushed in, sharp and alive, carrying the smell of snow that has never been touched. She studied the sky, the low clouds, the promise or refusal of weather written in subtle lines. He watched from his bench, struck by the way her posture changed outdoors, how she widened, rooted, as if the ice itself had drawn her from the ground. When she closed the door again, she brought the night with her, a presence that made the small space feel more intimate rather than less. She sat closer then, close enough that their knees nearly touched. The fire traced copper along her cheekbone, then retreated. He became acutely aware of his own breathing, of the sound it made in the quiet, of how it had steadied since the ravine. There are moments when the body decides before the mind catches up. This was one of them. Not desire in its simplest form, but recognition, the sense that two lives had brushed and left an imprint. She looked at him, and in her gaze was neither invitation nor refusal, only a question older than language. "Are you present?" He answered without speaking, because some answers cannot survive words. Outside, the ice shifted again, a long, distant groan that rolled through the ground and faded. Inside, the shelter held its breath. She leaned in, not far, not fast, and spoke softly, the words meant for him alone, meant to be felt more than heard. In that closeness, he understood that survival sometimes opens a door to something riskier than danger. Trust. The cold allows very little. What it allows completely. Morning did not break. It seeped. Light thinned the dark the way patience thins anger, slowly, without spectacle. The cold remained, but it had shifted, from threat to presence, from blade to witness. He woke before her, not because he was rested, but because pain has its own clock. His ribs spoke first, a low insistence that reminded him he was still inside a body, still accountable to it. He lay still, listening to the shelter breathe, to the wind moving along the grain of the world. Across from him, she slept in the way of those who trust their surroundings, not deeply, not defensively, but ready. Even at rest, there was a contained strength in her, a quiet awareness that did not turn off simply because eyes were closed. He studied the ceiling instead, the dark lines of smoke etched into wood by other nights, other survivals. When she stirred, it was without startle. She sat up, reached for her boots, and paused, sensing him awake without looking. That small recognition did something to him, tightened and eased him at once. She nodded, a greeting that did not demand response. Outside, the world waited, held in a pale, undecided light. Snow had fallen in the night, smoothing the land into a new grammar. Tracks would be erased, intentions reset. Winter is generous that way. It takes everything and offers a clean surface in return. They ate what remained, sharing the last warmth of the fire. He felt stronger, or perhaps simply less hollow. Strength, he was learning, was not always about muscle or resolve. Sometimes it was about being allowed to occupy space without explanation. She asked if he could walk. He answered honestly, not far, not fast. She accepted this without judgment and adjusted her plans accordingly, the way one adjusts a sail rather than cursing the wind. Outside, the cold bit immediately, sharp enough to make the eyes water. Snow caught on his lashes and blurred the edges of things. She moved ahead of him, setting a pace that respected his limits without naming them. He followed her prints, each step a small agreement with the land. The silence was layered now. The hush of fresh snow, the distant creak of ice under its own weight, the faint whisper of his breath inside his scarf. He felt exposed and held at the same time, a paradox the North excels at creating. They reached a rise overlooking the frozen expanse where the ravine cut its quiet scar. She stopped there, planted her staff, and stood listening. He did the same, though he did not yet know what he was listening for. The ice spoke in subtle ways, tiny shifts, a sound like fabric tearing far below the threshold of panic. She pointed once, not dramatically, just enough to teach him where danger sleeps when it pretends to be still. He nodded, absorbing the lesson, feeling the weight of it settle into muscle memory. Trust, he realized, was not built by declarations, but by shared attention. They walked on. The wind strengthened, combing the snow into low, restless lines. He stumbled once when his ribs betrayed him, and she was there immediately, not to catch him, but to steady him until he found his balance again. The distinction mattered. He straightened, embarrassed despite himself. She met his eyes, her expression neither pity nor impatience, only understanding. People carry what they carry, it seemed to say. The land does not shame you for it. Why should I? As the day stretched thin, they returned to the shelter. She tended to her gear, repairing a strap with hands that remembered 1,000 similar moments. He watched, thinking of all the things he had left broken because repair required staying. His life, for a long time, had been an exercise in departure, leaving jobs, places, conversations before they could ask him to remain. Here, in the measured quiet of her work, he felt the unfamiliar pull of continuity. Not permanence. Winter laughs at such notions, but the courage to stay until a thing is finished. He spoke then of regret, finally naming it. Not in detail, not with the expectation of absolution, but as one might name a landmark so it can be avoided next time. He spoke of a choice he had not made, a silence that had grown teeth. His voice did not break. It thinned, stretched by the cold honesty of the telling. She listened without interruption, her hands never stopping, the rhythm of repair grounding the moment. When he finished, the air felt clearer, as if something heavy had been set down gently rather than dropped. She responded with a story of her own, not of loss, but of endurance, of seasons that taught her when to wait and when to move, of elders who spoke less and meant more, of learning that the ice will sometimes take what you love and sometimes spare it, and neither outcome grants you control. What matters, she said quietly, is how you carry what remains. Her words did not offer comfort so much as alignment. He felt himself straighten inside, a subtle realignment that made breathing easier. Dusk returned with its blue edge, the kind that settles into bones. Inside the shelter, the fire caught again. They sat close, closer than before, the space between them now a known quantity rather than an unknown risk. Outside, the ice murmured in its sleep. Inside, something else began to take shape. Not urgency, not promise, but the fragile architecture of trust. He understood then that shielding her from falling ice had not been a heroic act. It had been an instinct, yes, but also a beginning, and beginnings in the North are as dangerous as endings. The storm did not announce itself with drama. It arrived as pressure, as a tightening in the air, as a silence that felt too deliberate to trust. The land leaned inward, listening to itself. She sensed it before he did. Not fear, calculation, the kind that lives in the spine and speaks without words. She rose from the bench and opened the shelter door just enough to taste the wind. It cut sharper now, carrying a grit that stung the skin and warned of movement higher up where ice pretends to be still until it isn't. She closed the door and met his eyes. In that look was a decision already made, one that included him without debate. They would not outrun what was coming. They would endure it. The shelter changed character as the storm gathered. Walls that had felt solid became membranes, translating the outside world into vibration and sound. The ice answered the wind with long, grinding notes, a chorus without melody. He felt it in his ribs first, each vibration echoing through the injury, reminding him that his body was now part of the landscape's conversation. He steadied himself, focusing on breath the way he had learned in other hard places. She watched him, adjusted the bindings once more, then nodded. "You are ready enough," the gesture said. Enough is often all you get. They sat close, closer than necessity required, because heat is a language the cold respects. The storm pressed harder. Snow rattled like dry bones against the shelter, then softened into a continuous hiss. Somewhere not far away, ice shifted its weight, the sound deep and intimate, as if the earth itself were turning in its sleep. He felt a familiar pull in his chest, the old instinct to leave, to put distance between himself and danger before it could claim anything else he cared about. The instinct rose and fell without action. He stayed. Staying, he realized, was its own kind of bravery. When the first crack split the air, sharp and final, he flinched despite himself. She did not. She placed her hand over his, not gripping, simply anchoring. The touch grounded him more effectively than words ever had. Another crack followed, then a thunderous settling that shook snow loose from the shelter roof. They waited, bodies aligned, listening for the difference between collapse and adjustment. The difference is subtle. It must be learned the hard way or taught by someone who already knows. She had learned it early. In the long hour that followed, fear tried on many shapes. It came as images, ice giving way, the shelter folding, the cold rushing in to claim heat without mercy. It came as memories, other nights, other losses, the sound of something breaking that could not be repaired. Each time it rose, he met it with the steady fact of her presence, with the simple truth that he was not alone in listening to the land. The storm did not need his panic. It demanded attention, nothing more. When the worst of it passed, it did so quietly, almost politely, as if embarrassed by its own insistence. The wind loosened its grip. The ice returned to its low murmur. Snow continued to fall, but gently now, smoothing the edges of what had nearly happened. They did not move immediately. Survival teaches patience after danger, the wisdom of waiting to be sure the land has finished speaking. He felt the tension drain from his shoulders, leaving behind a fatigue that was deep and earned. She was the first to exhale fully. The sound was soft, nearly lost to the crackle of the fire, but he heard it. He turned to her then, really turned, and saw something in her face that had not been there before. Not softness, she had always carried strength, but openness, a small, unguarded space created by shared endurance. She met his gaze without looking away. In that moment, the storm receded to the background of their story, important, but no longer central. He realized then what had changed. Trust had moved from idea to fact. It lived now in muscle memory, in the way their bodies had aligned without instruction, in the way fear had been allowed to exist without being allowed to rule. He thought of the people he had lost and understood with a clarity that hurt, that what he had feared most was not danger, but attachment, the risk of caring in a world that breaks things without apology. Here, in the cold that spared nothing and explained even less, he felt the quiet certainty that caring was still worth the cost. She leaned closer, the movement unhurried, deliberate. The fire traced light along the line of her jaw, then slipped away. She spoke then, Her voice low, meant only for him, carrying the weight of everything that had not been said since the ravine. The words were simple, almost startling in their directness. Not a demand, not a promise, an offering made in the aftermath of survival, when truth has fewer places to hide. He did not answer immediately. He let the moment settle, let it find its place in him. Outside, the ice shifted one last time, then grew still. Inside, the shelter held two lives balanced at the edge of something new, something neither fully understood but both recognized. When he finally moved, it was with care, with the reverence of someone who knows that some moments, once entered, cannot be undone. The morning came stripped of excess. No storm voice, no cracking ice demanding attention. Only light, pale and honest, resting on a land that had decided, at least for now, to endure. They stepped outside together, not as guide and follower, not as protector and protected, but as two bodies recalibrated by the same night. Snow lay deep, unmarked except for the memory of wind. The air carried that particular clarity that follows danger, the sense that everything unnecessary has been burned away. He filled his lungs and felt the ache in his ribs answer. Quieter now, less insistent. Pain, like grief, does not vanish. It learns to take up less space. She walked a short distance ahead, then stopped, waiting for him to come level. This was new, not accommodation, not caution, recognition. The land stretched open before them, frozen water catching the light like a held breath. Somewhere beneath the ice, currents moved with patience older than language. He wondered how many people had stood where he stood now and felt the same smallness, the same reluctant gratitude for being allowed to remain. They did not speak at first. Words, after everything, felt too blunt. Instead, she showed him how to read the surface, where snow hid weak ice, where the color shifted just enough to warn you away. He followed her gestures, internalizing them, understanding that what she was giving him was not knowledge alone, but continuity. This was how survival passed from one body to another, not as command, but as shared attention. He felt something settle in him, a sense of belonging that did not demand ownership. Eventually, the truth that had been waiting found its way out. He would leave, not because he wanted to, and not because she asked him to. Work would pull him back south, obligations tightening their familiar grip. The admission did not fracture the moment. It clarified it. She accepted this with a stillness that held neither disappointment nor detachment. Winter teaches you that nothing stays. Meaning is not found in permanence, but in presence. They returned to the shelter one last time. He gathered what little he had brought. Movements slower now, deliberate, as if imprinting the space into memory. She watched from the doorway, framed by light and cold, a figure both grounded and transient. When he turned to her, the weight of what they had shared pressed in, not heavy, but undeniable. He understood then that some encounters are not meant to be carried forward intact. They are meant to change the way you walk away. She stepped closer, close enough that the space between them disappeared without effort. He could feel the warmth of her through layers, could smell the clean bite of cold clinging to her hair. She lifted her face to his, eyes steady, unafraid of the vulnerability the moment required. When she spoke, it was barely above breath, the words shaped by certainty rather than need. An invitation offered without expectation of return, rooted in the knowledge that connection does not weaken survival, it deepens it. He kissed her with restraint, not because desire was absent, but because reverence was present. The kiss carried no promise of future seasons, no claim beyond the moment itself. It was an acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Fear faced together, trust earned without shortcuts, warmth shared against a world that takes warmth without asking. When they parted, the cold rushed in, sharp and clarifying, sealing the memory rather than erasing it. They stood there for a while longer, foreheads touching, breath mingling in brief clouds that vanished almost as soon as they formed. Then, without ceremony, they stepped back. She turned toward the land that had shaped her. He turned toward the path that would take him away. Neither looked back. They did not need to. What mattered had already taken its place inside them, steady and quiet. As he walked, the ice beneath his feet held firm. Behind him, she watched until distance softened him into the landscape, until he became another moving point in the long story of the North. The cold reclaimed its space, but it did not take everything. It never does. What remains, earned, fragile, undeniable, is carried forward in the body, in the way one breathes, in the way one chooses to stay when leaving would be easier. And somewhere between memory and frost, the land kept their secret intact.